Howdy y'all, welcome back, thank you for being here. The title of our video today, Inheriting Parties of 19th Century New York, is in itself a double entendre. As the lavish spectacle of elite class parties swept over Europe, the magnitude and questionable nature of these meetings of the world's most powerful began to draw the attention of the everyday masses, for it was through these seemingly backdoor and often underground, both figuratively and literally, meetings that entire facets of history came under the scrutiny of those key players who appeared to be deciding the future and possibly altering the past. And what was the catalyst for these magnificent and often opulent get-togethers? Well, none other than revolution. While romanticized festivities, like the great parties described in children's stories like Cinderella, almost assuredly happened throughout the Old World, a key component not often elaborated on in these simple tales is how these festivals and annual get-togethers were used as a way to introduce and intermingle the world's elite, often leading to intermarriages for the benefit of the families, businesses, and countries involved. A debutante, for example, was a young woman from an elite family formally introduced at one of these events where young men from other families would essentially make business proposals until the debutante's family found the proposal they deemed the most beneficial to their cause and country. However, following the French Revolution, it appears a massive shift in the nature of these parties took place. This shift then spread throughout the rest of Europe and then to America, where the concept appears to have been further extrapolated on to the point it may have actually caused the reshaping and rewriting of parts of the history of New York City. As today's video will delve further into alleged theories regarding New York's history in the 19th century, remember to take everything with a grain of salt. However, I will attempt to provide examples when possible to make these concepts as digestible as possible. Could the lavish parties, which took a dramatic turn towards the esoteric following the revolutions in Europe, have conceptually arrived in America, where the more esoteric aspects of these meetings grew to the front and center, driven by a desire, a want, what the elite may have seen as a need to control the narrative? Before the year 1655, the Brevoort family arrived to New York from the region of Holland in the Netherlands, settling first in what is today the neighborhood of Bushwick, Brooklyn, before resettling on the outskirts of New Amsterdam, in a location that is now part of the heart of Manhattan. However, at that time, 1655, New Amsterdam was a fledgling city, having only received municipal rights from the Dutch Republic 2 years earlier, in 1653, although the landscape had served as the capital of the Dutch province since 1625. The Brevoorts owned what was described to be a rather large and important tract of farmland just north of what would become Washington Square. Running through their land, what is described by many to be the private road of the Brevoorts was known as Fifth Avenue. This unpaved, dirt and mud road would eventually go on to reshape the history of America. We're told when city fathers, as they were known, of New York decided to extend Broadway, for example, they chose to swerve the street westward on East 10th Street, as to not attempt to pass through the Brevoort farm or risk angering the Brevoort family. At this time, the Brevoort farm was under the control of Henry Brevoort Sr., who in return had a son, Henry Brevoort Jr., who was described as a patron of arts, history, and leisure. Interestingly, Henry Brevoort Jr. was said to have married Laura Carson, a young member of a prominent family in South Carolina, although the details of their meeting and marriage are not given. Could this have been something that was arranged or orchestrated behind closed doors to help reshape the narrative? I digress. The Evening World newspaper went as far as describing Brevoort Jr. as one of the greatest gentlemen of wealth in the entire city of New York. Again, that's all very interesting, but what makes this even more fascinating is how the next part of the narrative plays out. The Brevoorts are described as some of the richest in New York. However, they were farmers, yet true patrons of the arts, and massive contributors to New York's economy. And yet, the main road that ran through their property was an unpaved one? Imagine the lavish architecture we are told was being founded in New York City directly before the time photography was introduced. From 1800 through 1830, we have some of the most massive buildings and structures that are said to have been founded in New York City. And yet, there is a dichotomy created here that I feel is truly worth addressing, because a lot of the pieces don't necessarily add up. Henry Brevoort Jr. was the main financial backer of writer Washington Irving, and we're told during Irving's lifetime, writing was not profitable, and Irving would have quit his craft had it not been for Brevoort's patronage. However, more interesting is the next piece. Around 1830, Brevoort Jr. decided that he wanted to build a massive mansion in the city, which would be unrivaled by any others. Brevoort aimed for the elite Bond Street neighborhood, where it was written that every single mansion in the city existed at that time, all of the elite in one space. The narrative then tells us that Brevoort's father, Henry Brevoort Sr., refused to allow his son to build his masterpiece on Bond Street, instead claiming that if he built his mansion on the edge of their property on 5th Avenue, the rest of the city's elite would follow suit. What's even stranger here is it's written that Brevoort Sr. refused to give his son the land on Bond Street, seemingly implying that the Brevoorts actually own most, if not all, the land beneath the Bond Street mansions as well. While the current narrative says the Brevoort farm was no more than 86 acres, it appears their lands may have stretched much deeper into the city. Either way, Henry Brevoort took his dad's advice and constructed the first mansion on the mud street of 5th Avenue, which itself acted as a private road for the Brevoorts. If we read between the lines, it appears whatever existed on the Brevoort farmland was finally being opened up to the public at this time. The Brevoort Mansion at 5th Avenue was founded in 1834 and is described as a Greek Revival masterpiece. Now, here is where, at least in my opinion, things become really interesting. For we have photographs of the mansion, and needless to say, it does not look very spectacular, at least not when we look at its architectural form, and it's also not very big. The current narrative tells us that the Brevoort Mansion was unmatched in New York City, with a house like this never having been seen before in the city. It was unrivaled, and it would set the precedence for every mansion that followed. My question becomes, how much of this mansion then would have actually been contained underground? For above ground, we only see 2.5 stories of building, a rather simple design with almost nothing that I would qualify as monumental or breathtaking. The Greek Revival aspects of this mansion were simple pillars out front of the door, and while the stories or levels of the mansion are rather large, we can see ceilings that appear to be 12 to 15 feet tall on each section, but alas, I still can't exactly place my finger on how this could have been considered the most intricate mansion in New York in the 1830s. That is, until we get into the next aspect of this narrative. The mansion was said to have been founded entirely for the purpose of hosting lavish parties for New York's elite, and the Brevoorts are given credit with throwing the first upper-class entertainment in the entire city, which was exclusive for members of society deemed to have enough power to reshape the trajectory of the city. For years, the Brevoorts were said to have planned what would become the most infamous costume ball in New York's history, a who's who of the richest men in the world, their families, their daughters, and suitors from all fields of industry and art. The event, which was held on March 1st, 1840, is described as setting the pace for social events of high society for the rest of the 19th century and beyond. In the months prior to the event, Philip Hone, former mayor of New York, is quoted as saying, and I quote, "Nothing else is talked about. The ladies' heads are turned nearly off their shoulders. The whiskers of the dandies assume a more ferocious curl in anticipation of the effect they are to produce, and even my peaceable domicile is turned topsy-turvy by the note of preparation which is heard." End quote. The Herald covered the party for months leading up to the event, once claiming that elites from all over the world were, and I quote, "moving heaven and earth in an attempt to get an introduction to the highly respectable Dutch family, and hence an invitation." End quote. Again, we have photographs of the mansion. It's large, but nothing spectacular. The Brevoort family were farmers. For all intents and purposes, they are not exactly whom you would imagine at the peak of socialite society, and their mansion on Fifth Avenue was quite literally built at the end of a mud road with nothing else on it. Unless there was something else going on at this costume ball, I quite literally cannot tell you why everyone in the world appeared to be clamoring to attend this event. Honestly, it makes me think that something much more nefarious could have happened here. But I digress. The narrative doesn't really stop getting stranger either. The night of the Brevoort costume party, former Mayor Philip Hone mentioned earlier, and he's key to this narrative somehow, but he was said to have thrown his own pre-party, which was said to have prepared guests for the following ball. We're told 500 of the world's most elite attended the Brevoort ball, and they all appeared in historic costumes, dressed as the greatest characters from history. These party guests included what was said to be the introduction of John Jacob Astor and August Belmont, much like debutantes to the elite society, which they would come to dominate just a few years later. Costumes described to the press included Joan of Arc, Queen Sheba, Queen Esther, and Diana of the Hunt. Mrs. Jonathan Ogden came as Queen Catherine of Aragon, and Charles Davis as a Quaker, possibly William Penn. However, it's also notable that many came as costumes that would push the boundaries of 19th century society. We have a few who came as depictions of Greeks, with their faces painted a darker shade. We also have a multitude of women who attended in male costumes and vice versa, including Nicholas Schermerhorn, who arrived as a blonde Dutch milkmaid. We also do not have any described depictions of indigenous people of America at this party, which is rather fascinating given the time period and location. Furthermore, given the controversy of just the costumes alone, it's also somewhat remarkable that Philip Hone, former mayor, described the event as a historical pageant of the highest taste. As details of the event began to leak out to the public through the newspapers, an outcry arose from the working class who deemed the party to be uncalled for and rather nefarious. The history also doesn't make much sense. For example, Matilda Barclay, daughter of the British consul, wore a dress to the event which cost well over $300, or over $8,000 when adjusted for inflation. While that created its own controversy, Matilda was dressed as a character from the epic poem Lalla Rookh. Also attending the Brevoort ball was T. Pollock Burgwin, the son of a merchant who came to New York from South Carolina for the party. Pollock, who had never met Matilda before, just so happened to be dressed as another character from the same poem, Lalla Rookh. As the story goes, the two met at the ball and bonded over their shared interest in costumes, and before the night let up, they had left the party, vanishing from their elite families. The next day, the two were spotted outside the Astor House, where it was found they had at some point gotten eloped. The New York Herald found out about this story and published it as front page news, leading to immense backlash from the public. So much so that grand parties and balls were made illegal in New York, punishable by a fine up to $1,000, which would be well over $25,000 when adjusted for inflation. The New York Herald grew to be one of the most successful newspapers in New York during this time, covering the misdeeds of the party guests. And guess what happened after? Just a few months later, the Herald was on the brink of shutting down, as it had lost all of its elite sponsors and was boycotted by the clubs, hotels, and homes of the elite of the city. The party guests basically put the paper out of business for trying to expose the truth. Sounds familiar. However, it doesn't end there. Following the Brevoorts' ritualistic party, New York's elite quickly began buying up property from the Brevoorts, and Fifth Avenue transformed from a mud road to the site of the largest homes in New York City. Some have theorized that a large portion of the original Brevoort mansion extended underground and may have been interconnected to other mansions that were later built through a vast system of underground tunnels, a network that was used to do many nefarious things. But again, that is just a theory. In 1848, Brevoort Jr. passed away, and the Brevoort mansion was sold to Henry de Rome. De Rome not only attended the original party, but he was also the leading dry goods merchant in New York. And would you believe it? He and the Brevoorts were actually distant relatives. Again, read between the lines. The de Romes owned the property until 1919, when they sold it to another distant relative, George F. Baker, whose wife was the great-granddaughter of Henry Brevoort. The Bakers, who bought the house, claiming they wanted to restore it, then leased the property to the Red Cross of America, who gutted it. By 1925, the Bakers removed the Red Cross presence from their mansion before demolishing it to build an apartment complex. However, the infamy of the Brevoort mansion and this seemingly unexplainable history would forever influence the trajectory of New York City. Whether coincidence or plausible deniability, we're told when Brevoort passed in 1848, one of the wealthiest merchants in New York decided to make his home on the fledgling Fifth Avenue. His name was Hart M. Schiff. He paid Detlef Lenau to design an intricate mansion to top the mansion of the Brevoorts. In return, Lenau is credited with founding or introducing the Second Empire style of architecture to the Americas. The Schiff Mansion, when completed, was then considered to be the first mansion in all of New York, in all of America, to be built in the Second Empire architectural style, which was a French creation, but then somehow swept over all of America. And it was this mansion, we are told, that caused nearly every major city to start building using the Second Empire architecture. If you're interested in learning a little more about Second Empire architecture, or just seeing some more examples of it, I have a video that I made a little over a year ago where we dive into some of these examples, some photographs of Second Empire architecture. And we also look at the ties between massive statues that were being created at the end of the 19th century and the Second Empire architecture. So after this video, consider checking that out. Schiff, just like Brevoort before him, did not have a long time to enjoy his completed mansion, as he passed away in 1851, less than a year following its completion. At that time, Fifth Avenue began to grow rapidly into the hub of New York's richest families, and it appears through the vast underground connections that these elites used these mansions for many different things: merchant activities, reshaping and planning events, and possibly even designing the models that would reshape history itself. That is the story of the first costume ball held in New York City, a history that ties to the very interesting nature of the Brevoort mansion, the Brevoort family, the Brevoort farm, and raises our questioning of just how deep and how nefarious this history actually could be. Fifth Avenue, once a lonely mud road, was transformed into the site for the largest mansions and richest families in the city of New York. However, all of the roots of these mansions can seemingly be tied back to the sale of these properties by the Brevoorts following their elaborate costume party held in 1840. Again, that is only the current narrative. And for all the questions that arise, one thing is for certain: the history of New York City is never exactly as it seems.